Hi guys, this is Kristen out at Old Santee Canal Park, and I'm one of the educators here on staff. And for the next few weeks, we are going to be taking you out for some virtual field trips. So we're going to be using some of our educational programming that we do here at the park for field trips and public programs. Today we're talking about swamps. So I'm actually going to take you into the swamp with me. We're going to talk about what makes a swamp, some of the plants and animals that live here, and what makes them important, and why they're important. So what makes a swamp? So first of all, they're characterized by having water, and that water level can change. It receives water from rainwater, groundwater, and also from a larger body of water. So usually swamps actually sit next to a larger water body. In our case, we actually sit right next to the Cooper River. So they can be saltwater or freshwater. For hundreds of years, ours was actually more of a brackish swamp. But nowadays there's more of a barrier between that brackish Cooper River and our freshwater swamp. So it is mostly freshwater with some brackish water thrown in. But it's characterized by water, very slow moving, right? And it has trees, so that's what sets it apart from being a marsh. A marsh is covered in grasses. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take you guys with me out into the swamp, and we're going to check out some of these things. All right? So what makes swamps different from marshes is that they are characterized by trees, whereas marshes are characterized by grasses. Here at Old Santee Canal Park, we are characterized as a cypress swamp because we have these gorgeous cypress trees that live here. And a cypress tree is a really good example of an organism that has adaptations, right? That over time have evolved to help them be really successful in their habitat. So remember, an adaptation is a trait or a characteristic that helps that organism flourish and do really well in their habitat. Remember, a habitat is an animal's home, right? So what these trees do is they have a really cool root structure. So if we were trees in a proper forest, we would actually send our roots underneath the ground, right? And that's where we would get our nutrients, and that's how they would stabilize the tree. But in a cypress swamp, right, they're standing in a swamp, right? They're in a giant puddle for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what they actually do is they send their roots out into the swamp mud and then straight up, and they actually stick up all around them. And those are called Cypress Knees. And for a long time, scientists debated on what that was actually used for. Was it used to get more oxygen for the tree? Was it used for stability? But the common theory is today that it's actually for stability. So even when we have flooding here or hurricanes, because we're in coastal South Carolina, these cypress trees are able to stand for hundreds of years. And actually, this particular cypress tree right here, there's a very large Osprey Nest, which is really, really cool. And if you look here, this is a really good example of Cypress Knees. So these guys can be several feet in height. And it's when you have a lot of cypress together, it's even kind of hard to know which tree the knees belong to. But these are a really good example of cypress trees and their knees. All right. So follow me. We're going to go check out some other stuff. Now, the first thing that people notice when they come to a swamp usually is that the water is kind of brown, right? And a lot of people first off are like, oh, swamps are kind of weird or gross. But once you actually get into it and you become a swamp scientist like we are today, you actually realize that there's a really cool biological process happening. So what happens is we have all these awesome trees that we talked about, and when they go to lose their leaves, right? So even the cypress tree loses his leaves. When they go to lose their leaves, and those leaves are dead, right? What color are dead leaves? They're brown, okay? And so what happens is those leaves are dropped into the swamp, and remember, swamp water is very slow moving, and because the conditions of the swamp, that decomposition, right, that breaking down of those leaves, it's actually releasing a brown substance called tannins, right? And because there's not a lot of turbidity or movement in the water, we can really see those tannins, and they really settle into the water. So that's why swamp water is brown, right? It actually has nothing to do with being yucky or gross. I always ask people, if a habitat was really gross, could plants and animals live there? And the answer is no. And as you can tell by all the bird song that we have lots of plants and animals that live here. We have birds, insects, mammals, reptiles, all kinds of different plants, shrubs, trees. So really, really healthy spot. And it's also good to know some of the jobs of a swamp, right? First off, first job that a swamp has is super important, is to be a proper habitat and be a good habitat for plants and animals. So remember, to have a habitat that's successful, you have to have resources. You have to have food, water, air, and shelter. If you have those things, plants and animals can survive and flourish, right, as they do here. So swamp is a really awesome habitat. Number two is a swamp is a filter. So all these amazing plants that you see behind me, what they actually do is they can filter out the water. So they filter out things like phosphorus and pollutants, and they filter that out of the water. So not only is the swamp not gross or dirty, it's actually pretty clean. And then finally, a job that the swamp has is to be a giant sponge. So this is really important when we have hurricanes or lots of water and flooding here. This swamp actually holds on to that water. So the way that the vegetation is set up in the soil, it can actually hold on to that water like a sponge. And that's really important, right? Because it protects our visitor center, it protects the schools nearby and our neighborhoods. So swamp is part of flood control. And we absolutely need that. So for a long time, people thought swamps weren't super important or didn't really have a lot of uses for humans, but come to find out, swamps are exceedingly important and they have to be protected. So let's see if we can check out some critters that live in the swamp. So I'm going to show you some smaller critters in a second, but real quick, there is a banded water snake right here. So these guys are water snakes. They are non-venomous, but he's got these really pretty bands underneath. And then there's actually somebody else that we're going to show you. So there is a juvenile alligator, our prothonotary singing in the background. We actually have a juvenile alligator out here. So this is an American alligator, Alligator mississippiensis. Okay, so if we were doing a swamps class here at the park, what we do is we actually take out dip nets and we try and see what we can catch. And we kind of study them, figure out a little bit about their body and who they are, and then we release them back to the swamp. So I've actually caught a few things for us that I'm going to show you guys. And the first thing, people are always curious about fish. There are lots of species of fish that live here in the park. I don't know if you can see that little guy, he's moving around. There are lots of different species, but the one that we catch the most in swamps class is the mosquito fish, which is what he is. We call them mosquito fish because they actually eat mosquito larvae, which is super important, right? They're really good for population control, along with lots of other animals that live here. But what's really cool about mosquito fish is they're what we call live bearers, all right? So instead of laying eggs to have babies, like a lot of fish do, they actually carry their babies. Which is really interesting. So that's the mosquito fish, and he lives right at the surface of the water, right? Because that's where his food source is. So we catch him a lot. And let's see. One of my favorite things to catch in swamps class is called a dragonfly nymph. These guys are awesome. So I'm going to show you in the bucket, and then I'm going to take him out. So he's that weird little like water alien cockroach looking dude kind of swimming around. So believe it or not, that is a baby dragonfly. Okay, so dragonflies actually have 3 life cycles, and this is one of them. So they get to be eggs, and then there's something called a dragonfly nymph, which is what he is, and then they get to be adult dragonflies. What's really cool is that this nymph stage, first of all, they're in this stage longer than any other. So let's see if I can kind of hold him so you guys can see him. So this is a dragonfly nymph. All right, and these guys are considered predators, okay? So even though they're kind of small, they actually are pretty voracious predators. And remember, a predator is an animal that eats other animals. So he, during this stage, can actually swim throughout the swamp, okay? And what he does is he actually uses his bottom jaw, and he can shoot out his bottom jaw and actually grab prey and bring it into his mouth. And he does this constantly. So he can actually be a nymph for several months. And then he's actually, depending on his species, he'll only be an adult for a few weeks, okay? And what he does is when he's a nymph, besides eating, is he comes out once every couple of weeks, hold onto a piece of grass, and he cracks out of his skin. And then he grows, he's grown, right? So he cracks out of that old skin, and then he goes back in the water, and he does that process over and over again until finally his last cracking out of his skin, he's a dragonfly. So he's really, really cool. One of my favorite things to catch in swamps class. And one of the really, really cool things that live in the swamp. So thank you guys so much for tagging along today. I've had a great time taking you out into the swamp. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.